All right. Let's talk through some of the things that have really changed in the admissions process over the last couple of years, because the past couple of years have definitely been very transformative to the admissions process at colleges. So, what have been some of the key changes to college admissions since 2020? What we've really seen is that 2020 and 2021 caused some pretty dramatic shifts in the college admissions process. The first is that acceptance at many colleges became even more competitive, and test optional and test blind even policies became nearly universal. Social justice and diversity became even more top of mind for admissions officers. And a trend that we are seeing diminish, but that still exists, is that more students are opting for gap years, whether it's because they're worried about COVID restrictions on campus, or it's because they need just a couple more years to develop themselves before they apply to college. Though that trend is definitely diminishing as colleges and I guess broader society have opened back up since 2021. And there's been a growing trend towards homeschooling, which is something that is actually continuing to grow over the last couple of years. Now, one of the I guess most challenging elements here is that college admissions is more competitive than ever. And pretty much every college in the country became more competitive during COVID, or at least the vast majority of colleges became more competitive during COVID, in part because test optional policies sparked so many more applications. Just as an example, Ivy League colleges accepted for an average across all of them of 4.3% of applicants. And 17 other colleges actually have an acceptance rate below 10%. So there's a lot of schools where 90% or more of applicants are getting rejected. And it's not just the usual suspects, right? There's obviously, you expect Chicago or Harvard or Brown or USC or whatever to have lower acceptance rates, but even schools like Northeastern, which went down to 7% last year, Florida State, which was 23%, and Tulane, which was at 10%. There's a lot of colleges that just 5-6 years ago were 25 or 30% acceptance rates, still selective and competitive admissions processes, but not crazy, that are now starting to get into a really competitive territory. Even at a sort of flagship public college like the University of Georgia, the acceptance rate dropped from 54% in 2016 to 41% in 2022. Things are getting more competitive, and I could sit here and say, oh, don't worry about it, but it's not my place to sugarcoat things for y'all, right? Now, part of what has driven this rise in competitiveness is the rise of test optional policies. Nearly every college in the country now has some form of test optional policy, which is essentially a policy that says you can apply with an SAT score or an ACT score the way that you used to, but you can also submit an application without an SAT or ACT score. Now, there are exceptions, right? For example, MIT just recently actually reinstated its SAT test requirement, and the University of Georgia, which you just mentioned on the previous slide, actually still has an SAT or ACT requirement. So there are some notable exceptions. About 1,700, 1,800 plus colleges are now either test optional or test blind. And this, especially when you look at test blind schools like the entire University of California and California State System, and even Caltech, which I'll be honest was a little surprising to me. When schools like that are test blind, this causes a ton of randomness in admissions decisions. Now, test optional doesn't always necessarily mean that you have the same chance of admission or certainly of getting a merit scholarship without a test. Especially at selective colleges, the data kind of suggests that even though they are test optional on paper, they're still tests required or tests strongly encouraged in practice. And so the general rule of thumb that we like to use is, or the general advice that we like to give, is that you should still try taking the SAT or ACT because you don't have to submit, but having a good score is still a real leg up. Now, the final trend that we've just been tracking is sort of the changes in how important social justice is to the college applications process. And colleges and universities, especially in the wake of kind of George Floyd's death in May of 2020 and everything that happened after that, have really started to intensely focus on diversifying their incoming class, right? And there's a couple of sort of corollaries to this, right? First, if a student has something on their resume that goes against this ethos, it can and increasingly is being held against them, right? If a student is part of, say, conservatively oriented extracurricular activities, that is something that absolutely will be held against them. It doesn't mean it's impossible to get in with those things on the resume, it just makes it harder. There's also a ton more essays and interview questions about how students contributed to social justice and diversity. And the, I guess, frustrating thing sometimes for families is that this focus on social justice is more often used as a sort of negative factor against students than it is used in a positive way. And if a student is part of a target recruiting demographic that is in that sort of category of diversifying the incoming class, the flip side is that these kinds of students can consider submitting an application even if their profile doesn't always match up on traditional metrics. So there's both good and bad, right? It has increased access in some ways for students from some backgrounds, but it also has made things tougher for other students.